This episode of Transmission Interrupted was recorded April 23rd, 2025.
This is Transmission Interrupted, the podcast series from NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center. Welcome to Transmission Interrupted from NETEC.
Hello, and welcome to Transmission Interrupted. My name is Jill Morgan. I'm a nurse here at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you not yet familiar with NETEC, our mission is to set the gold standard for special pathogen preparedness and response across health systems in the U.S., with the goals of driving best practices, closing knowledge gaps, and developing innovative resources. NETEC works alongside and in cooperation with the CDC and is funded by ASPR, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. On today's episode about frontline connections, we're just going to talk. I am very lucky to have with me today Tristan Twohig, an ED nurse from Providence Holy Family in Spokane, Washington, Caroline Persson, who co-leads the IPC and the BCU leadership workgroups for NETEC and comes to us from Denver Health, and Stefanie Lane, who co-leads the Regional Coordination workgroup for NETEC and comes to us from Mass General in Boston. So welcome y'all to the show. I'm really excited to talk about this interface of ED, ER, and infection prevention.
Thanks for having us, Jill.
Yeah, so exciting. And what a literally cross-country representation we have today. I'm not sure that we could get further apart than Tristan and Stefanie. All right. So, we're here today to talk about this interface, right? Where EDs are shipping and receiving patients via EMS. EMS is picking people up from all over the place, getting the story they can. And what we end up with is this, I think, sometimes loss of communication, right? We don't always know what's coming in our door. We don't always know, I'm sure from an EMS perspective, what you're just going to open the door and see when you go to pick somebody up. And I guess one of the concerns is how that carries risk with it. And I don't just mean like the risks that all of us have. If you're on the front line, you don't know what somebody's going to do or the situation you're walking into, but really more about the risks when it comes to infection prevention, infectious diseases, all that kind of stuff. So I would just like to start by kind of clearing some things that might be y'all's, I don't know, your pet peeves, your little nuggets that, niggle at the back of your brain. What are the things about that interface that just kind of you see as most problematic? So let's see. Steph, you want to start with pet peeves?
Oh, absolutely, Jill. And this is a favorite topic of mine as somebody who has been on both the EMS and the healthcare side. It's like sometimes when EMS shows up, they got the wrong invitation to a dinner and might be dressing for a luau when in fact it's a formal event. So one of the things that I really like to think about, it's a pet peeve, but it goes so much more than that because it digs really into the safety of the matter of that communication. So EMS in the field, they adapt as they need to as they get additional information, and they absolutely have a responsibility to relay that information, but healthcare facilities do as well. And so healthcare facilities sometimes get that extra time to prep, and it doesn't feel great for anyone when EMS shows up, maybe in a jumpsuit, maybe in a t-shirt, and you're seeing the healthcare providers on the other side that are fully decked out and ready to go, possibly for an Ebola patient. So that communication and coordination is key. And how do you do that handoff successfully, both so that the patient is safe, but also keeping your providers safe? So if that's a pet peeve, that is definitely one of my big ones. We just want to make sure that that information is getting relayed.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. And maybe for just a little bit of background, I'd like to talk more about how even communication happens. And I say that as somebody who worked in an ER a very long time ago, when we literally had a radio sitting on the counter that we could, I knew by voice who was working EMS that day in a small town. But that's not true for a lot of places, right? So how is that communication happening? Is it a phone call? Is it going straight to a triage person? Like, where does that occur?
Yeah, what is that expression that the time to exchange business cards isn't at a disaster? So I think these exchanges are happening ahead of time because there's a real effort to meet others who are working in other areas and not to silo yourselves. And emergency departments have got a lot going on, but making sure you have that connection in. It might be a phone call, it might be on a radio into a triage nurse. I think defining those routes ahead of time. I know we're focusing today on our bio threats, but when we think about it, any hazards, it is so important to communicate that information in for the safety on both sides. But it really does need to be defined because also some of this might not necessarily be going over the air. So establishing those lines of communication before is really important.
Well, that's a great point because there are some things, that you would want to perhaps warn somebody about. I mean, and it could be something like this person spits, right? I mean, that is one of the most disgusting things on the planet to me. But there's also patient privacy and things like that. So I agree, that establishing where and what communication happens and making it more normal, hopefully to also think about the safety of the people on the other side. Tristan, I know you're an ED nurse and I know you're on the other side of the country, obviously from Steph, but what's your experience on that communication side of things?
The communication side of it, I think, is critical. And, there's been initiatives regionally, at least, but I think it's probably more widespread than what I can see out here on the West Coast. But moving toward a plain language communication model, instead of having color codes for overhead announcements in hospitals or the old trucker 10 codes that law enforcement still uses, just being as simple and as plain as we possibly can alleviates the concern that we're misinterpreting our intention for relaying critical information, and particularly over the radio, which isn't a secure form of communication. We have to use only the most pertinent information possible. And I think that's kind of a struggle with AEMS or emergency system. But I'd actually take the opportunity to talk more about the regional issue, with the pet peeves regarding about how we address both communication and PPE. I think one of the larger issues is how regional norms are different than what should be for universally accepted standards. And I can rephrase that. During COVID, for instance, we observed how adherence for infection prevention and particularly masks had varied dramatically across parts of the country. And that divergence wasn't necessarily political and more of an affected regional culture, but even with local communication strategies, there was a difference with institutional leaderships. And so throughout healthcare, I don't think we can afford that kind of variability. Our use of PPE should be grounded in national evidence-based guidelines, such as those from the CDC or NETEC, and not influenced from particular zip codes or social cultures or norms. So if we're all using the same standard and base of what should be accepted nationally, then we can alleviate the need for different types of communication. In emergency situations, right, and the inconsistencies where pathogens usually exploit, where we should probably be doing more than the annual check the box training, so more routine scenario-based validations. And the PPE protocol is being practiced in real-time scenarios, real-time settings, and supported by leadership, and treated with a consistent standard and not a sliding scale. At the end of the day, this isn't about compliance, it's more about building a culture of protection. And frontline teams perceiving PPE as optional or inconsistent as we undermine trust and safety even before the crisis begins. So yes, communication is the most important thing up front, but if we just have a national standard that we all adhere to, understanding evidence-based norms, I think that should be our goal.
What a great message is that we do normalize things, right? I mean, I hope that we normalize protecting each other. That is, I don't want to pass risk on to anyone else. So whether it's the way I wipe off a blood specimen tube in a special pathogens room before I hand it off to my lab, or I make sure that EMS is aware of what somebody has or might have before they pick them up, or we standardize some language around what kind of PPE or precautions somebody should use. It is about reducing the risk for each other. And it's a trite phrase, I guess, but this is a situation where we really are all in this together. I have depended on EMS professionals in my career in so many ways and have learned so much. I think the first time I've heard the phrase, is the scene safe? And the other phrase that I love is, first, don't be a victim, right? I mean, like that was just, I didn't hear that in nursing school, right? I heard that from EMS and fire. And I think it's so important, especially when we're thinking about like special pathogens care and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that because we have Caroline, who's such an expert nationally on infection prevention, I think, Caroline, I just want to hear what you think of like, what are the risks at that interface from like when you think about your hospital and what's happening inside there? Or your EMS, because I think at Denver Health, you guys have an EMS service associated, right? So you're seeing both sides of that.
Yeah, Jill, I think I just would echo what Stefanie and Tristan said. I think I wouldn't call it necessarily a pet peeve, but I think the biggest opportunity to sort of support the ED-EMS interface is just improving communications. Everyone has different information, and oftentimes we forget that people don't have the same information or they don't have the same baseline information. And so in general, someone has to hear something 5 to 7 times before you receive that information, internalize it, and are able to apply it. So thinking about a patient handoff, as Stefanie beautifully said, sort of the different expectations coming to the dinner table. EMS might have information that would help with the appetizer, whereas the ED might have information that would be beneficial in cooking the main course. Ensuring that both teams share that information to have a beautiful 3-course meal is really critical. And as you said, we'll make sure everyone has the same level of information so they can practice as safely as possible, protect themselves, protect others, and provide the highest level of patient care possible.
Yeah, I really heard this a lot from several friends who work in long-term care. And, long-term care really suffered with PPE shortages, I think even more than many hospitals did. And it was super frustrating. And I think some of y'all have mentioned this as well, where like one team is in PPE, and as Stefanie said at the beginning, another team isn't in PPE. Maybe they didn't know, maybe they don't have it. Maybe they've gotten to the point where they're like, there's nothing else I can do or be exposed to. We really want to hopefully get past the idea that being exposed to stuff is just an okay part of our jobs, right? Because it shouldn't be. Yeah, I think that's, I'm really glad we sort of kicked it off with that kind of communication, even though I agree they weren't really pet peeves. So,
Jill, it sounds like maybe we need to normalize sharing is caring, except for the disease.
Okay, I that is probably a little too Mary Sunshine for me personally, but I think it is a good message, right? Because sharing that kind of information is caring for each other, and you're right. That's a very nice use for it. So I think part of this is that we haven't actually mentioned my name, but it's part of this identify, isolate, inform model, right? So NETEC talks about that a lot. Really, we're trying to normalize that certainly across both EDs, points of entry anywhere, and points of entry to the EMS system, right? So whether have been able to have your 911 center ask people questions, whether you get any information before you go to a scene, this idea of early identification of pathogens. And really, we're not talking about identifying exactly what a pathogen is, which pathogen it is, but we're talking about identifying that somebody has something you don't want, right? I mean, if you have a cough and a fever, I really don't care what it is. I don't want it. I don't want to breathe in whatever you're coughing out. And likewise, I think if you've got, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and a fever, there's so many things that could be. None of them are things I want. So it's that kind of idea of saying, think infectious diseases, isolate appropriately, and then informing. A big part of that is letting other people know. We're not talking about, at this point, calling public health, which should be on your list later on. But this initial thing is just making sure each other are safe and that you're not passing risk on to the next person. So, Tristan, from talking to you earlier, I know you have a really good story that highlights this identify, isolate, inform model in like real life.
Yeah, so I think that's the perspective from a frontline ER nurse, where we talk a lot about these types of ideas and policies and procedures and the implementation on system scales. But I've had the opportunity to have, firsthand experience in it. And so I think a quick preface is how we phrase emergency medicine and how the ER is typically where we operate in a space from which infectious diseases will meet operational chaos. There is a constant background of concern amongst anybody that comes to an ER. The reality is that a prodromal phase of many special pathogens or any pathogens, particularly if they're vague, GI distress, malaise, fever, headaches, those can easily get drowned in the constant barrage that are long wait times and overcrowding and minimal resources that the ER has. In my situation, before I became a member of the special pathogens team out here in Region 10, we had identify the triple I's. The identify, isolate, and inform was triggered through our standard triage criteria. And it was a patient that had recently traveled to sub-Saharan Africa and came back with enough symptoms that it kind of triggered that box. But due to our intake process, we caught it, and it was a protocol that we had in place that was set up by how do I want to phrase that correctly? There was a preemptive training that all ER staff had, that we had a procedure in place should this happen. We ask every patient that comes to the ER, have you been traveling outside of the country in the last 14 days? And if the answer is yes, prompts a whole other set of questions. And it's all scripted. It's all very standardized, and it should be. But in this case, we actually had one. And I was working that day, and I wound up being the primary clinician at the bedside. Because of the foundational training that Region 10 had invested in, and because we had outreach to hospitals in the area, we had resources that were available to us. We were able to act quickly and decisively, and we had PPE in a bag kits, and we were able to do negative isolation. And we wound up with me at the bedside with a binder, our SPU binder, which had all the resources and all the checklists and all of everything that we needed. And that was probably the most valuable tool. And it may not have been the actual protocols. It was actually the first page, and it was a list of phone numbers. And so I am now bedside in a negative pressure room in a hospital with the phone numbers to everybody who I could have possibly have needed. So yes, it was through the county regional department of health. Yes, it was to the infectious disease on call, but it was also to the special pathogens program manager and their cell phone. So being able to make a phone call in real time and saying, hey, this is what I have, this is what we've done, this is where we're at, we're going through this process, is there anything you want to try and intervene on? That was absolutely critical. And that was, I think, the moral of the story, is that none of that could have been happening if we didn't have that forethought, the investment and the time and the procedures to be just available to it. So before my participation with special pathogens team, this could have been just any nurse anywhere. And it struck me that if we can do this type of outreach and this type of training regionally throughout smaller hospitals or critical access hospitals, it's probably the right structure for the leadership from which that same framework could be implicated on a much more wide scale. Places where the patients can show up, and if there isn't the kind of training or the awareness, or if it's a very small hospital with a staff of 12, some of the stuff wouldn't have been caught like it was caught at a system that had been reinforced or fortified with the procedures to be able to act decisively. The work doesn't belong to a particular hospital department. I think it's a regional responsibility. And that's one of the reasons that it brought me into the special pathogens team, was witnessing all the people that had put forth all the effort to be able to institute a triggered protocol and the resources made available of those who needed it at the time.
Yeah, because you're right. It's not just, I understand that there are still places doing things on paper, and I get that that's a lot of people's reality. It's difficult because then how these messages are transmitted, how you get education, how you make sure the next steps, which are so important to keeping people safe, happen. I mean, this is just one of those situations where I think as much as it took kicking and screaming and dragging people into like EMER changes and yet another question in triage, these are protective, right? These are letting us identify people early. We had a situation where before we were doing this kind of screening, we missed a fever and a new rash. And that person who ended up, of course, having disseminated zoster was sitting, guess where? In our oncology waiting area, right? Because we missed it. And as Caroline knows, that's an IP nightmare, right? You're trying to track down people that were exposed or people, you're just putting really vulnerable people at risk. But sometimes we're the vulnerable people. And I want to get to a quote from Stefanie Stefanie, I don't even know if you remember that you said this, but I just wrote it down and I just thought it was so funny and absolutely true, which is, do you remember what it was?
Around receiving patients and how you may receive more than the patient?
Yes, it may be more than the patient you're receiving. I mean, I think that's just such a clever way of putting it, right? Like, oh, I get as an ER nurse, sometimes you are handing me a train wreck. I mean, and we get it. It's just these people have incredibly complex medical histories. There's everything wrong with them. But here we are. I may not be aware that I might be getting something from this patient in the form of an infectious disease. I don't want to take RSV home. I don't want to take hepatitis home. I don't want to take any of these things home. So yeah, I like the idea that we need to be aware that that's a possibility.
Yeah, Jill, this is not the gift you want to keep on giving. So this is really that time to recognize what's coming in your door. Because while you think about it as a patient that you're going to treat, it's more than the patient if you don't identify when you need to. And these lead to significant alterations of care. And I think we all know that emergency departments do not have the capacity to alter. They need every space. They need all of their staff to be on. And when we think about it, even I understand the part of identify is a lot because the cognitive load of even having to go into work in an emergency department right now is a lot. So making sure that we can identify these patients and then minimize the effects that are downstream is vital to everyone.
Yeah. And Caroline, from your perspective, what does happen? These things occur, right? Somebody gets exposed to something. Maybe you didn't know they had TB. Maybe you didn't know, they had whatever. And it's a super frustrating experience as a nurse to, you take care of somebody you don't know or you haven't suspected they have anything. And then you come in for your next shift and they're in isolation and you're like, oh, goody. I was, as the phrase goes, all up in there yesterday, but now they're in isolation. So what have I been exposed to? But from your perspective, you're the one sort of tracking these things down, right? From the hospital side of things. What does that look like?
Yeah, Jill, I think it's a great question and something that ultimately takes a lot of effort from infection prevention or occupational health to ensure that not only are the folks who are potentially exposed identified, but they have the resources to empower themselves to seek additional support, whether that be post-exposure prophylaxis or maybe they need to be taken off shift. When I really think about the benefit of identify, isolate, inform, I think of it as a framework that empowers staff to ask the question about the patient they may be treating, no matter where in sort of the care continuum they are. And I think no matter how we apply it, whether it be an electronic medical system, whether it be on paper, whether it be something that, hey, something doesn't sound right, let's inquire a little bit further. That's the benefit of identify, isolate, inform, and that can be translated to pre-hospital, during, patient care in a hospital, or upon discharge as more information comes to light. So I know that wasn't quite your question, but I really see that being the benefit of identify, isolate, inform. And then hopefully, as that framework is translated and staff are empowered to take that message to their day-to-day bedside care or their day-to-day scene care or their day-to-day care in a long-term care facility, we will have less exposures or less potential exposures that then infection prevention or occupational health in collaboration with public health need to follow up on to support our healthcare workers and ensure they have the right support, the right information, so that they know what to do if something does come about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important. And of course, we're talking today about protecting each other and both sides of this ER, EMS interface. But of course, there are also patients, right? what we do to protect ourselves also protects the next patient we're visiting, the next person we're taking care of, or the next person in that room. So having that index of suspicion that this could be something infectious, kind of going back to that, some of the statements from the very beginning, that is the scene safe? Well, if you're not in PPE and that person has something, that scene isn't safe for you, right? In order to make the scene safe for you, that requires protection. It requires covering your eyes, nose, or mouth, or whatever that the transmission pathway might be. And really, we want to get that into people's heads, that these questions aren't just to check yet another box on a triage form. It's actually to help keep us all safe and our whole healthcare environment safe.
Yeah, Jill, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of the tasks of IPs and other folks that are supporting staff who ultimately are asking these questions is, how do we reinforce this message knowing that they do have a bunch on their plate and it keeps adding on? And I think I don't have the golden bullet for that, but I think it's something that we keep it for at the forethought of our mind as we think about special pathogens, and always love to hear how others are doing it or how they found success in supporting staff as they come across more and more things and are expected to do more and more with less and less time.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like Tristan really felt empowered, if you will. It's probably an overused phrase, but empowered by having had that training. I really think it's like any of us who've ever done CPR in real life, right? You realize when you step into that situation that your training does come back to you, that you do have that sort of clarity of, I know what to do in this situation, right? Like you're counting compressions, or you're giving breaths, or you're doing first aid by the side of the road. We go into an automatic mode because we've been well trained. And I think, this idea, Tristan, that you were able to walk into that situation with a rule out case of a special pathogen and be like, I got this, right? I've got a notebook that tells me who to call, but I've got this because I had some training.
I find it fascinating in my observations how quickly confidence spreads when the protocols are clear. When you can see a team member go from unsure to empowered when they know what to do, where to go, and who's backing them up. And it's just critical that we have the infrastructure and the training and the resources available for situations like this, because if a pathogen of high consequence falls through the system, how many healthcare providers could be exposed on the first, the second, and the third interactions of them being seen at urgent care or a hospital, or having been called an ambulance to go to an ER. And without this being identified, then you've dozens, upwards of 100 perhaps, of somebody who goes back to the hospital several times.
And certainly, that was a recent experience in Iowa with a Lassa fever case. I think that it isn't a matter of this is something that's going to happen, maybe never. It happens. It happens all the time. And the better we get at identifying the special pathogens, the safer we keep our healthcare facilities for all the regular pathogens, like norovirus or measles or, any of the stuff that you just don't want. So I guess I'm a little curious because I hear a lot about burnout. I mean, we've probably all teetered on the edge, right? If we're still in healthcare, we've probably teetered on the edge and come back in these last few years. But even before that, I mean, EDs and EMS agencies are tough places, as y'all have all mentioned today. So I really want to think about, how do we extend this support? How do we strengthen each other and the resources and the knowledge base and just be forces for good where we overlap? I'm curious if people have ideas, this Stop the Bleed campaign, which is so popular and so important. And I think we've got this bleeding of our healthcare providers, and we need to figure out how to stop that. I think part of it is with empowerment. As you said, Tristan, it's people feel better and can function better if they have some clear path to knowledge and skill. So I think that's a great first one. But I'd love to hear what you guys think about how we move forward and protect each other.
I'll hop in here. I think a big part of it is the fact that healthcare workers are heroes. They put other people first. And I think it's slowing down to recognize that the individual providing the care is worth investing in as well. And I think that means it during a shift. It means to stop and think, how am I going to keep myself safe so I can continue to offer care to patients? It's thinking about the identify, isolate, inform algorithm as it's not just a one-time deal. As you get more information, how do you adjust? Do you then put on PPE? Do you need to inform other people? And I think starting with that idea that individual healthcare workers are worth investing in, then it might open up opportunities to invest in others. So I think about it with walking through an emergency department and helping a fellow coworker tie their gown because maybe they didn't and they're not putting themselves first. So that self-care and investment, I think, is critical.
Yeah, thanks for that. I love that message and just such a simple thing of just helping somebody literally put on PPE.
I could actually piggyback on Stefanie there. I'll make the case that we could even invoke the need for emotional PPE, right? The leadership that models our healthy boundaries and the institutional policies that prioritize rest and recovery and psychological safety are just as important as physical safety, particularly when we talk about burnout. And supporting each other means, in my view, making space for vulnerability and for increasing team cohesion. It's unsustainable to ask people to keep showing up to a broken system and investing in peer support programs or embedded mental health resources or having leadership that listens and not just audits. That's how we keep our teams intact. It's how we make them thrive. So to stop the bleed of burnout, I echo Stefanie, is that we need to stop glamorizing self-sacrifice. If you're only as good as your last shift or how much sleep you skipped, what are we reinforcing exactly other than a system that collapses at a moment that pressure rises? And protecting our workforce protects our system. The system is only as strong as people willing to show up. I think it's critical.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I'm going to want to give Caroline one more chance to chime in here, but I want to just riff off of something you said. I am part of the generation that created an unhealthy work environment in healthcare. So I cop to that. I will apologize for that here and everywhere I go, because I think we did think that there was something, I don't know, heroic about having blood on our shoes or going back to back to back shifts and being exhausted. We worked for years without real breaks or adequate coverage or adequate PPE or didn't know anything about our PPE. And honestly, when people talk about, these young people these days, they just don't have the same work ethic. You know what? Maybe they're right. I want people to be able to stay in healthcare and stay healthy in healthcare. And we didn't set it up that way. I mean, I used to actually say, I only want to do trips with people who are other ED or ICU nurses because I know we all have 12-hour bladders. That's awful. Nobody should have a 12-hour bladder. That's just not a good thing, right? But you thought it was at some point in my misguided life. So I absolutely agree, Tristan. I think you and Stefanie's messages here are so important that if you call somebody a hero, it puts them in a category you don't have to think about them again. These are people who have every right to go to work and not be exposed to somebody else's body fluids. Now, having said that, it's all about risk reduction, right? There is no completely safe thing in healthcare, because I am telling you, I don't think there's a single ED or EMS worker who, when approached by a parent carrying a limp child, would not take that limp child, right? That is what we went into this for. But that's not our everyday. We should be able to protect ourselves most of the time. All right, Caroline, I promise I won't interrupt.
No, thanks, Jill. I think norms and expectations are hard to change and hard to shift. It's even harder when norms and expectations are sort of implied when, these blanket terminologies like healthcare workers are heroes is used so loosey-goosey. I don't have a good solution to healthcare worker burnout, but I like to think of this concept of sort of the cone and the cube problem, where everyone has different perspectives. They see the cone in the cube differently. And the only way we can solve it is together by getting all of the different perspectives, whether that be different generations, whether it be different roles, whether it be people in pre-hospital, in acute care or long-term care facilities together to talk it through and share the different perspectives. So ultimately we can come together and try to find solutions. And those solutions might be, sort of incremental over time, but I don't see any other way to do it than to come together and work together to find those solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I also think it's just so important for us to think about each other as coworkers, right? To me, EMS, they're my coworkers, whether they're from a different agency or a different company, that doesn't matter. Healthcare workers are part of this misfit club of people, and we need to stick together and we need to protect each other. So I really think these messages of communicate better, communicate consistently, think about wanting to protect the person who's picking up your patient or the person who's receiving your patient, communicating all kinds of risk and making sure that we're not taking unnecessary risk, right? That we're protecting ourselves because, as Stefanie said, we need to be able to show up the next day. In order to do that, we have to be healthy. We have to not take those things for granted. So I really think this whole idea of sort of frontline connections is very important. And I think the idea of strengthening resiliency is strengthening the ties between us. So I think that's a great message, Caroline.
I think we often forget people are whole people. They're not just a reflection of the work they do. They are a reflection of people they are outside of work, and we're outside of work more than we're inside work. And identities are multifaceted. And I think it's always helpful to recognize that everyone has different stories, and that brings value every day to work.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think I was just thinking that also may be part of the reason that one person might have a mask on or a respirator on, because you don't know what their risks are at home. You don't know who they're going home to. You don't know that they might have some special circumstances. So giving grace about these things and being as understanding as we can be is super important. All right. I would love to wrap up with any last minute thoughts you guys might have to sort of lend this overall message. I am a little sorry we didn't get in the phrase, don't lick them, but I'll let that one go for now, Stefanie, because I have a feeling it was you. But any last messages?
Yeah, I'll offer one, especially on the EMS note. And Jill, as you talk about the scene is safe, EMS made sure that scene was safe as they could to bring that patient to you. So just make sure the scene is safe for them to come into. And as you get more information on both sides, just relay that, because at the end of the day, we still need healthcare workers to be able to come to work tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you. Tristan?
I believe that resilience isn't about perfection. I think it's about preparedness. We don't need flawless systems. We need empowered people working in environments that support them. Training, resources, communication, and trust. Recognizing what protects healthcare and the workforce protects the public that we serve.
Wow, I love that. That's going to end up being a quote somewhere. Caroline, any last minute thoughts? Although I love your last one.
I got nothing. I'm just thankful to be a part of this group.
I am thankful for this too. It's a good reminder. I think we all have coworkers, both proximal and distal to us, right? The person I hand off a specimen to, the person I hand off a patient to, the person who comes in to do an x-ray or get a consent signed. And we have an obligation to protect all of those folks and them to us. So I really like this idea of talking to each other and talking about this frontline relationship. And so as we enter the season of healthcare worker days, I know there's like hospital worker day and nurse day and all of these things coming up. I just really want to thank, first of all, the three of you, but also I am so grateful to have had a career filled with brilliant, caring coworkers. I am grateful all the time to be a nurse. And I'm not sure how many careers I could have had that would last this long and still have me say that. So I am one very lucky person. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. And thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining us to talk about frontline resiliency and and really trying to strategize and make that a safer interface between EMS and EDs anywhere. So thank you guys very much. And thank you for those of you who are listening at home. We thank you for tuning in to this episode on Frontline Connections. We hope you'll join us for future episodes on a wide range of topics, from healthcare worker safety, as we talked about today, to personal protective equipment. Everybody knows that's my favorite, and even more about other infectious diseases of all kinds. If you have any questions for NETEC or ideas for future shows, please feel free to reach out to us at info@netec.org. You can find us on the web at netec.org/podcast, and you can subscribe to future episodes and find more information on today's topic. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on Transmission Interrupted.
You've been listening to Transmission Interrupted, the podcast series from NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center. Learn more at netec.org.